Hello, friends. Nayaswami Hriman here, speaking to you from the Blue Lotus Temple in Bothell, Washington, just north of Seattle. Today's broadcast on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda, I take an article from one of his magazines, as I have done previously. But thinking of the conflicts that are raging in Europe and Ukraine and this kind of conflicts, many kinds of conflicts, but that is a military, violent one. What caught my eye in a recent republication or printout of one of the old magazines was an article called, that I had mentioned in a previous broadcast, but it's called The Mystery of Mahatma Gandhi. And in this article that Yoganandaji wrote in September of 1932 is a story I hadn't ever come across, and I was glancing through the magazine, and I wanted to share it with you. It's a rather startling story. A few points that Yogananda mentions. He said, Jesus did not live to see much of the results of his work and the results of the suffering that he undertook. Gandhi has been more fortunate. No saint has been so famous during his lifetime, attracting people only by the miracles of ideal human conduct and character. And so that's a curious point. I hadn't really thought much about that. Gandhi, by his ideal conduct, is growing in popularity and will go down through history as a great savior who has changed not only the destinies of individuals, but of India and of nations. Instead of criticizing him, even his deadliest enemies admit that Gandhi is sincere. Now, this story then that I'd like to share with you is an extreme example of Gandhi's doctrine of resisting evil by the force of love. So I'll read parts of the story. It takes place in the Golden Temple of Amritsar, which is the famous Sikh temple. I once visited that in the fall of 1975. It's quite a beautiful place. And I suppose millions of people must go there during the year, both tourists but also devotees, Sikh devotees alike. So this incident, this story, was quite remarkable to me. The Sikhs, I don't know a lot about their history, but they're known for their fierceness and are employed sometimes as in the different armed forces of India and probably the British before that. And when I was there, I remember seeing busloads of pilgrims coming from other parts of India, Sikh pilgrims with their daggers. They're more symbolic daggers, but very fierce-looking fellows coming off. And then I remember that when I went into the main building upstairs, I think it was a museum, and it was filled with pictures of Sikh military people in the Indo-Pakistani War of 1967 was it? Don't remember the date, or 72. Not that long before I had visited there. And there were, jet pilots and all sorts of people. So they are a fierce bunch of folks, but very sincere. And so this story is remarkable. In the Golden Temple of Amritsar in India, there lived a debauched priest who controlled and misspent millions of rupees that were derived from the incense of the temple. So I guess they made and sold incense. I've never heard of this debauched priest, but anyway, Gandhi's followers, which must have, of course, included Sikh devotees, protested, and in return the priest ordered them to stay out of the temple on pain of death. Now that alone is interesting, pain of death. I mean, it's one thing to be excommunicated by the Pope or something, but pain of death is a little bit extreme. 200 of Gandhi's followers, Akali Sikhs, traditional warriors who carry little sabers as an insignia of their religion, entreated the priest to allow them to worship in the temple. They wished to free the people from this burden but intended to use only peaceful means by resisting with love and not by physical force. And then Yogananda goes on to mention the famous charge of the Light Brigade, which I think that took place in the Crimean War, if I recall, and these guys got massacred or something. But he says they marched to death with cannons roaring to the left and the right. But these 200 followers of Gandhi willingly walked into the jaws of death, armed only with small daggers. When they reached the temple yard, they were met by 20 of the followers of the corrupt priest. Gandhi's men allowed the handful of priests to shut the temple gates behind them. And then these 200 fierce, stalwart warriors were tied to the pillars of the temple, their clothes soaked with kerosene, and they were burned alive by the 20 priests. Now, if that isn't the weirdest story, these 200 warriors made no physical resistance. Not one used his dagger against the handful of 20 who were murdering them in cold blood. Imagine what spiritual force Gandhi possesses in order to destroy the crude, fierce fighting spirit and military anger of these warriors and train them to be meek and to use the mighty weapon of love to fight evil. And then he asks, Yogananda writes, he says, what was the outcome of this tragedy? Although 200 perished, they demonstrated what Gandhi had said. If bloodshed is necessary, let it be your own. Let's see what else he says here. If the 200 had fought and used force, thousands would have been drawn into the battle and killed due to the clash that would have resulted between the outraged people and the police. Instead, although 200 perished, by their death they accomplished the end that they desired. The priest and his followers were arrested and punished, and once more the temple was reconsecrated and opened to the public. You know, Amritsar, the city there where the Golden Temple exists, was the site of the massacre by General Dyer in, what year was that? I think before this, if I recall, in the 20s, was it? When he opened up with rifles and killed the peaceful protests, many of whom were undoubtedly Sikhs in Amritsar, Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims and so forth. So that's a rather stark example. But this is what Gandhi spoke of, and people like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela and others realized the power of nonviolent resistance. And I don't know how we might apply that in the case of the Ukraine. It would take tremendous courage. But the power is there. We have the power. And just as a handful of people charged at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and more or less tried to overthrow the whole place, it doesn't take that many people, whether through violent or nonviolent means, to overthrow a government or make changes. And that's the message that we're getting again and anew in this time. And it's unleashing for the moment a rash of an increase in violence in America that I see reported frequently because people realize what they can get away with. Well, it's time to use that same potential in peaceful ways to also make changes. And that is happening. The Black Lives Matter protests, some of which got violent, admittedly. People take advantage of these things, or in any case get stirred up and they lose control. But the point is, and this is true for devotees and meditators and sadhus and saints and avatars, the power of consciousness to change entire nations, to change the course of history. Jesus and his 12 minus 1 disciples, Paramhansa Yogananda and a handful of disciples, Ananda World Brotherhood communities, handfuls of disciples living together. The power of change is in our hands for those who are courageous and who band together to act in harmony with truth. Okay, well, that's it for today. Thank you. Bless you.